So I want to talk about a number of different projects that have happened over the course of the last 20 years. I'm not going to get into the methods because it comes from different areas. We had some preliminary work back in the early 2000s, and then we did a tagging study, and then we did some pre-evaluation in anticipation of a slot limit coming into place, and then we put the slot limit in place, and then we have plans to reevaluate it, but at this point there hasn't been enough time passed to evaluate it yet. So that's kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about to give you kind of a timeline so I don't confuse you when I'm going through stuff. Like the Ozarks and Truman, if you go 230 miles straight north of here, you'll end up on the right side of this map, about the middle, not too far from Bagnell Dam. So my perspective is a little bit different. I grew up going to Truman Lake, hearing stories about Truman Lake, and I came in to this project after a lot of everything had been done. The slot was in place. I've only been in my position for 2 years. But I was familiar with the fishery because it's when I went to the lake in the summer, I went to Truman Lake. And I heard about the good old days of the catfishing where you could go out and catch big catfish. This is a photo of my uncle from 1980, right after the lake had been completed, catching a nice blue cat. And I got to hear these stories growing up, and we'd go to the lake for the summer and go trot lining. And I remember it was about 2003, Kevin Sullivan did an angler diary study where people could voluntarily participate in creel surveys. And my brother had came across this somewhere, and he was excited about doing this creel survey. They had some rewards for people that participated. And we went down to Truman, and we set our trot lines out. And the next morning, we went out to check our trot lines, and we started running the lines, and there was a little bitty blue catfish, another little blue catfish, another little blue catfish. And when we got done, it was kind of disappointing. We didn't catch any big fish. We just caught a bunch of small fish. I mean, it's nice to catch something, but wasn't anything you'd write home about or nothing to take real big photos of. And it turns out that we weren't the only people that have came to that conclusion. 40%, over 40% of the people that participated in the creel survey, the volunteer angler survey, had rated the fishery as poor, compared to almost 15% excellent. That's not the numbers you want to see when you're taking your angler input. And in another survey, most anglers felt that the blue cat fishing had declined over the last 10 years from 1992 to 2002. And there had been some other indicators that we as MDC had seen to know that there may be some issues existing on Truman. And Lake of the Ozarks is part of the same system. Truman Dam is in the middle to split the two, but some of the same things. Maybe the timeline was a little farther along on Truman than Lake of the Ozarks, but we saw some of the same issues happening. So we did a tagging study and wanted to look at exploitation. And I'm not going to give you a lot of detailed numbers, but I'll put it in a little image here. Our exploitation was somewhere between 30 and 35% from what we estimated, and we put natural mortality at 15%. That adds up to close to 50% of your fish being taken out of the population every year. If you do that over 5 years, only about 1 out of every 20 fish remains. And a fish that can live close to 30 years, that's not numbers that produces a lot of old fish or big fish. Here is a length frequency histogram from some of the data we did, and the red bars represent 5-year increments. So the first red bar on the left is about a 10-year-old fish, and then 15 and 20, and it'd be nice if I could put a 25 on there, but there's really no point in it because there aren't any fish out there. And if you bring back up what's happening to the fish, 5% remaining every 5 years, and you can kind of see that is reflected in our length frequency histogram. So we did a little modeling, and I'll cut to the chase. We looked at a slot. That's kind of what we thought would be best. We took some public input along the way and ended up with a 26-inch to 34-inch slot limit. Our numbers estimated that that would result in about 5 times as many fish over 34 inches. And for us, that 34-inch seemed like a reasonable number for us to shoot for to get fish to kind of as a trophy size. The process of changing the regulation was not easy. We submitted a proposal. The public didn't really like it. So then we came back and we submitted another proposal and ended up getting the regulation put into place on March 1st of 2014. And you can see a photo of taking the angler input there, and you can see in the background there's a board with catfish on it. That represented the fish that could be kept under the new limit, 2 over 34 inches and a total of 10 fish. So to increase our public support, we put this board together to give a visual, not just talking about numbers and lengths and how many you can keep, but actually being able to see this is what you can keep under the new regulation. And as part of all this, we wanted to be able to evaluate it. So from 2010 to 2012, we did some pre-evaluation using jug lines. So some of our management goals were to protect those mid-sized blue catfish. We have really good recruitment. Our fish grow really slow, unfortunately. And once they hit about 20 to 25 inches, everybody wants to keep them. So we wanted to protect those fish. We ended up putting the slot at 26. From a management standpoint, I'd like to see that number a little bit lower, but you have to make a compromise with what's reasonable and what the people want from a fishing standpoint. But we wanted to at least give some level. Once they hit that 26 inches, they're protected for a few years. We doubled the daily limit from 5 to 10 with the hopes that we would increase the harvest on the small fish that are overpopulated. One of our goals was to retain our anglers. For obvious reasons, we want people to keep fishing. There was some backlash from people who still to this day say we put this regulation in place to run the jug line anglers off the lake. That's simply not true, but we have to consider what the people want because that's what we manage the fishery for, and make sure that everybody is content and still wants to come here under the new regulation. And then try to maintain good relations with all the stakeholders. Our evaluation was 2-phase. We had our pre-regulation phase where we did our jug line from 2010 to 2012. And then the regulation changed in 2014. And we decided that to really let the regulation start to take its place and change based on our growth rates, that it would take 8 years before we'd really make sense to evaluate it. So we're looking at 22 through 24. We're going to get back out and reevaluate it, see where we're at. We're going to measure all the catfish we catch before and after, and we'll compare those to a before the regulation was in place and after the regulation was in place. Wanted to look at age length structures, and part of our post-evaluation will involve angler surveys to look at satisfaction and get a grasp for how the public and the fishermen perceive the regulation after 8 years. So we use jug lines, as I've mentioned. One of the main reasons we settled on jug lines was because it represents what the people are catching. There's a lot of jug line on the lake. It's really popular. So we understand that it might bias your data a little bit, but it biases our data in the same direction that the angler's output is biased. So here's our jug line setup. We receive a few questions from people every once in a while wondering how we did it, what our setup was. We have a buoy with a PVC pipe through it, and then 30 feet of line off of the one side with the hook. It has an egg sinker to hold it down, and the other side the weight's off of 60 feet of weight. So basically we'll throw the weight out, let the line come, let the weight take itself to the bottom and unravel, and then we will, let me have a slide here. I guess I'll skip around. So we'd use gizzard shad for bait, and we'd cut a large gizzard shad into up to 4 pieces. And then this is my slide. So we pre-bait everything, get them sitting there ready, and then hook the weight on, throw the weight out, and then unspool this, the end, and let that line come out the other side. So we'd have a weight line and a line with the hook on it. We typically set those out in some kind of a line that just ends up what happened, and you'll float one direction, you'll set one out, and then you'll set the next one out. And for sample sites, we divided the lake up into places that we knew were suitable sample sites and randomly selected 30 sites, and then we had 10 additional overdraw sites if there was some issue where we couldn't get a sample in. We had a backup plan. And then we took pectoral spines for age and growth information. Here's an example of the sites we randomly selected in the fall of 2010 to sample. The sites that are in red were ones that we sampled, and the sites in white were extra sites. Zoom in with a little more resolution, and you can see that basically each site, there was a dot and a circle around it, and our jug lines would be somewhere in that circle. We'd sample in the fall, August through November. Because of the magnitude of this project, we had multiple crews on both the Lake of the Ozarks and Truman Lake, and we considered 50 jug lines set overnight as one sample. And then we had a minimum of 10 fish per site. If we ended up short, we would float jug lines the next day to catch additional fish as long as we had time. And then we documented length and weight, and eye injury is kind of a notable one with the circle hooks we were using. A lot of times they would end up leaving an eye injury, maybe leave the fish blind. So that was something we wanted to note just to see what we're dealing with there. And then fin clip, pulled the spines, and then we released them. Here's some information on our catch data for Truman. You know, somebody asked during Paul's talk, what bias there is. You can really see in there about 21 or 22 inches is where it really seems like we're starting to recruit the fish to the jug line gear. Lake of the Ozarks was not quite as much of a peak, but same type of trend. And I'll also point out on these two that the lack of fish over 40 inches is pretty concerning. I mean, a lot of people, you've seen some of the slides earlier, the giant catfish, your fish at about 48 inches of blue cat will hit 50 pounds. And I mean, that could almost, so you could almost argue that's a baseline for a trophy fish, at a minimum. And 48 inches isn't even on my graph because we ran out after 40. So there aren't a lot of big fish in this fishery. We collected spine data and age data, so all the orange dots are combined Lake of the Ozarks and Truman from 2010 to 2012. And then the blue dots, this kind of gets into my results, but we haven't done the official results, but kind of trying to peek at stuff right now while I have the opportunity. The blue dots are fish that I've collected over the last 3 years for the most part. I have an angler that I collect a few fish from, and a few months ago he asked me, how old are these fish that are going into the slot? So he collected a handful of fish for me that were 25 to 26 inches, and we looked at those, and that the black lines represent the slot limit. So you see some blue dots on the right side just underneath that black line that are 25 to 26 inch fish that are 14 to 16 years old. That number is a little concerning to me. I'm afraid maybe our growth has even slowed down a little more, but we haven't formally evaluated that. But there's a lot of different things this graph could mean, and we don't necessarily have the data set at this point to say exactly what it is. Point out, I did have one 29-year-old fish. There's a photo of the otolith. I was interested to see that. It is nice news to know that they can live for a long time in the lake. And we do have some kind of results question mark and some reason for optimism. This photo is from the guide I worked with some, and I asked him if I could use the photos, and that's why I have his, but there's a number of other guides that post photos like this fairly regularly. The photo on the right is from Sunday, so it's not like I cherry picked. I just got the one from 2 days ago, and yesterday, or day before yesterday, I had a pretty similar slide, and yesterday he posted that it was a little bit slower. They didn't catch the big fish, but they still caught 3 people at a 30 fish limit. So the guides are at the very least being able to catch a lot of fish, and they're very successful from a number standpoint, and we're seeing a few of these larger fish over the slot. This fishing report from a couple years ago saying it's some of the best catfishing they've seen in years. And then we were out on the lake for a little bit. One site, it's promising to see the increase in the number of fish, 32 to 40 inches that we've caught when we were out doing some other work. The sample size isn't enough to really statistically say anything, but at least it's a reason for optimism. Acknowledge the people that help with this project, and a lot of this work was done before I was even employed with MDC, so even more than most people, I have to thank everybody that came before me and helped on this project. And looks like maybe we have a couple minutes for questions.
What are your restrictions on jug lines?
So 33 hooks, so they could put out 33 jug lines if they had 1 hook per jug line. If you put 3, then you only get 11. If you want to fish on your own, then you got to take those out of the numbers, but basically 33.
You mentioned that you thought the slot limit was too high.
Right.
Your anglers didn't really like it lower, which that seems to be probably everywhere. But where would you like it to be, if you don't mind?
It's been a while since I've looked at that data, but that exploitation numbers really start to increase probably 20 to 24 inches. And then you get into some other issues where if we have a stunted population down lower, I mean, I'd love for them to be catching 10 or 12 inches and keeping them, but I mean, we got to be realistic. So
the other part of that is in your link frequency of the reel, I didn't see a lot of fish sub 18 inches. Is that because they're not available, or is that because they're just releasing those fish?
So the data I showed you was from our jug line study. And we're probably not recruiting those fish to the gear at that point because of the hook size. It has nothing to do. There are plenty of small, under 18-inch fish out there. Paul mentioned the struggles they've had on Mark Twain electrofishing for blue cats. That has not been a struggle for us. We can shock up lots and lots of 8 to 10-inch.
Well, I was more interested in your anglers' willingness to keep those really small 14, 16-inch fish tucked in. Do you see that that's occurring?
I don't have any creel data. I suspect, and I know the guys are targeting the 20, 25 and a half inch fish. I think a lot of that, and it's going to depend on how many fish they're catching too, and I don't know how much willingness there is to keep those smaller fish.
Well, thanks, Chris.